Hey guys, tonight we're curling up with a tale that starts soft and warm, literally. You're surrounded by endless woven patterns, deep burgundy reds and golds, the air thick with the scent of cedarwood and ink. You hear the rhythmic clatter of looms echoing across the tiled halls of a centuries-old bazaar. Everywhere there are socks, stacked, stretched, stitched, fine wool, shimmering silk, coarse cotton. But this isn't a quirky Etsy store. We're deep in the Ottoman Empire, and you're about to discover that socks weren't just a matter of comfort. They were taxed mercilessly, with ledgers, with officials, with penalties. And no, you probably won't survive this if you're a modern freelancer who's never even itemized receipts, let alone justified the cost of a left ankle warmer to a sultan's bureaucrat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now in your corner of the world? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly through an Ottoman marketplace in the year 1582, the sun already high, warming the dust underfoot. Traders shout in a cacophony of Turkish, Greek, Armenian. You pass stalls brimming with embroidered kaftans, fragrant spices, and oddly enough, dozens of intricately folded pairs of socks. Some are tall and stately, others short and utilitarian, some braided with gold thread. You ask the stall owner what makes these so expensive. He doesn't answer. Instead, he points to a ledger nailed to the wooden frame of his stall. You squint. It's not a price list. It's a tax code. This is your first brush with the Ottoman Empire's complex, bewildering sock tax system, a tangle of fiscal logic, imperial ego, and textile pride. It wasn't always this way. At the empire's dawn in the 14th century, socks were humble things, mostly homemade, crafted by women for family use, stitched from leftover wool. But as the Ottoman economy expanded and its bureaucracy bloomed like a particularly nosy tulip, socks took on symbolic meaning. They became identifiers of class, of region, even of occupation. Wealthy elites imported fine silk yarn from Persia or even Venetian territories, and had socks tailored to match specific court costumes. Soldiers in janissary ranks were issued state-approved pairs as part of their uniform kits. Religious leaders wore white wool during Friday sermons to symbolize humility, though you can bet the wool came from a very expensive sheep. And as more people wore more socks, especially in bustling trade cities like Istanbul or Bursa, the taxman began to sniff opportunity. Historians still argue whether the earliest sock levies were truly formalized under Sultan Bayezid II or simply encouraged informally by local officials looking to pad the imperial coffers. But by the mid-1500s, there's no doubt about it, sock taxation was codified. One document, an archived Defter tax register from 1579, lists over 200 sock-related transactions in the province of Rumelia alone. Yes, just socks, itemized by length, fiber, pattern complexity, and even color. The logic: socks weren't essential garments anymore. They were expressions of wealth, and therefore taxable luxuries. You could wear a sock, but if it shimmered too brightly under candlelight or bore too many stripes, you'd owe a few extra akshas. Think of it as a medieval sales tax with a suspicious amount of footnotes. And just like that, you realize you're not walking through a cozy bazaar anymore. You're tiptoeing through a fiscal minefield where even your left heel might cost you. You shuffle forward, the cobblestones uneven beneath your worn leather soles, suddenly aware that even those might be drawing bureaucratic attention. The tax register you glimpsed now lingers in your mind like an itch. How could a sock be taxed so obsessively? And why socks, of all things? To answer that, You need to understand just how obsessed the Ottomans were with textiles. In this empire, fabric wasn't just clothing, it was identity. It spoke of your village, your trade, your wealth, and even your politics. A bolt of cloth could serve as currency, a bribe, a dowry, or a diplomatic gift. In some border regions, taxes could even be paid in textiles instead of coin. It was serious business. The empire's textile economy stretched from the sheep-filled steppes of Anatolia to the bustling silk routes of the east. Wool came in rough bundles from the highlands. Cotton was grown in the warm plains of Egypt. Silk glimmered its way in from the Safavid court, often disguised to dodge import duties. And socks. Socks were where all of these threads met literally. You pause in front of another stall. This one is run by a wrinkled man with a mustache wider than his shoulders. He proudly displays socks in a dizzying variety. Knee-high riding socks made from camel hair, brightly patterned ankle socks dyed with indigo, soft indoor slippers stitched from goat wool. He lifts a pair of creamy silk socks, trimmed in metallic thread, and whispers, "For weddings, very taxed." There it is again, that twinkle in the eye when they say taxed, as though it's both a joke and a threat. The Ottomans, keen observers of material culture, knew exactly what kinds of goods crossed their markets and how to slice a bit off the top. That included garments, robes, turbans, belts, and yes, socks. But why did socks deserve their own category? For one, they were ubiquitous, worn by rich and poor alike. They were easier to count than larger items, and unlike cloaks or boots, they had fewer excuses for being worn out when inspectors came around. Also, socks were often traded in pairs but sold by material weight, which made them a delightful challenge for imperial tax accountants. Historians still argue whether the sock tax originated as a subset of general clothing duties, or if it was introduced as its own line item during a short-lived tariff reform in the 1530s. One fringe theory even claims it was imposed after a palace official received a counterfeit pair of ceremonial socks stitched with cat hair instead of goat wool, something that supposedly enraged the Sultan so much he demanded stricter oversight. Whatever the origin, by the time you're walking this imaginary market, the sock tax has mutated into a Baroque system of surcharges, exemptions, seasonal brackets, and color-based modifiers. A crimson sock dyed with Armenian cochineal could be taxed at 3 times the rate of a plain brown pair. The justification: crimson was considered court-adjacent, a color of prestige, and therefore subject to higher duties. Yellow socks, sometimes tax-exempt during summer months, for reasons no one can quite agree on. Some say it was due to their use in religious rituals. Others suggest a bureaucratic error that simply never got corrected. You bend down to examine a pair of faded gray socks. No lace, no shimmer, just functional. A tax document posted beside them explains they qualify for the agrarian wool bracket, meaning they were likely made in the provinces, outside major trade hubs, and thus incurred a lower flat fee. And here, at last, you realize the deeper truth. The sock tax wasn't just about revenue, it was a census, a quiet mapping of the empire's feet, where they walked, what they wore, and who could afford to tread with elegance. You drift toward the edge of the marketplace now, the crowd thinning slightly as the morning light sharpens. The hum of commerce gives way to a quiet ticking in your mind, a puzzle unfolding. You've learned that the Ottomans taxed socks based on color and region. But what about the stuff itself? What made a sock taxable silk, or mere peasant wool? Let's talk materials. Silk, in the Ottoman world, wasn't just fabric, it was almost sacred. Its shimmer hinted at wealth, but also knowledge, as if wearing silk somehow made your thoughts silkier, your decisions smoother. The best silk socks were impossibly fine. Their threads spun so tight you could barely see the weave. They were imported, expensive, and reserved for the upper-crust viziers, court ladies, visiting envoys. One pair of socks made from Bursa silk could cost more than a servant's annual wage, and that's before the taxes. Wool, on the other hand, was your everyday hero. It came in grades, from rough and scratchy herder wool to the soft undercoat from Karaman sheep. Prized for its loft, wool socks were favored by soldiers and merchants. They lasted through wet winters and dusty roads, and because of their popularity, they were often taxed by bulk sacks of them counted at caravanserais by tax scribes who didn't even need to unroll them. Just poke, weigh, record. Cotton played a middle role, more breathable, easier to dye, and mostly used in warmer provinces. Cotton socks came in brilliant colors: turquoise, saffron, emerald, and were particularly popular among young men trying to show a little flair. These were the Instagram filters of the 16th century, except subject to fluctuating duties based on color, complexity, and origin of dye. And then there were the sock hybrids, the real mischief makers. Imagine a sock woven with silk on the outside, wool on the inside, plush, dazzling, and just confusing enough to make a tax clerk cry. The Ottomans had a category for that. 2 double-warped textiles. These required dual inspection, one official for the silk, one for the wool. If they disagreed, you got taxed for both. A very Ottoman solution. Historians still debate whether these hybrid socks were popular because they were comfortable or because they created just enough tax confusion to be worth the cost. Some argue entire cottage industries sprang up just to make socks that slipped between categories. In one notorious record from 1591, a shoemaker in Skopje was fined for attempting to declare his luxury socks as stable coverings for mule hooves. A creative dodge, to be sure, except his mule was reportedly sockless and deeply confused. And what about fringe tidbits? You want weird? In 1612, a minor prince gifted his future bride a chest filled with exactly 99 pairs of socks, each made from a different combination of fabric. It was less a dowry and more a tax accountant's nightmare. The marriage lasted 3 months. The audit took 3 years. As you wander further, the feel of the city shifts. You're not just in a market anymore. You're walking through a museum of Ottoman identity, one footfall at a time. A society where what you wore on your toes wasn't just a comfort, it was a statement, a declaration, a taxable expression of who you were. You turn a corner and step into a quieter lane. The babble of traders replaced by the scratch of reed pens on parchment. Here is where the magic happened, or the madness, depending on how you feel about bureaucrats with too much time and too many categories. This is the domain of the Ottoman scribes. Inside a modest office with arched windows and thick stone walls, rows of men in kaftans sit cross-legged, hunched over ledgers. You watch one of them carefully copy a line. One pair, crimson, silk thread heel, Bursa origin, peacock motif. 3 akçes, paid. Then he pauses, narrows his eyes, and adds a footnote. Possible over-embroidery. Re-inspect in winter. That's right, there were people who made careers out of judging your socks. The Ottomans were bureaucratic geniuses or villains if you were on the paying end. Their love for paperwork bordered on romance. Entire branches of government existed purely to document textiles. Not collect, not distribute, just document. Especially when it came to goods that moved across borders or into major cities. Socks, small as they were, represented a kind of low-hanging fruit for this obsessive data culture. They were easy to hide, easy to smuggle, but also easy to track. So the empire leaned in. A specific classification emerged in official tax records, çorap vergisi soktax, a sub-branch of the larger giyim vergisi or clothing tax, but with its own subsections, because of course it did. You walk past another scribe, this one surrounded by colored threads, his job, confirming sock hues. Yes, There was a post, sometimes temporary, sometimes lifelong, dedicated solely to identifying whether a sock was properly dyed in indigo, not cobalt. The pay was modest, but the prestige, impeccable. Historians still argue whether these tax scribes operated independently or under local guild oversight. Some believe regional governors appointed their own favorite sockmen, while others point to letters from Istanbul demanding more central control over provincial hosiery audits. That phrase alone has haunted at least 3 academic papers. And what if you were caught cheating? The punishments varied. If a sock seller underreported their inventory, they could be fined double or even lose their trading license. Worse still, if the deception involved foreign materials like passing off Cypriot cotton as local, you could be reported to the Babu Ali, the Sublime Porte, the Imperial Council. For socks, imagine standing in court explaining your choice of thread blend while a judge frowns at your ankles. But perhaps the quirkiest element, bureaucrats had sock quotas. Monthly. In Istanbul alone, tax scribes had to report how many taxable socks had passed through each Han caravanserai, bazaar, or ferry port. These tallies were compiled into regional charts, allowing the empire to track not just revenue but style trends. One surviving document from 1607 notes a surprising spike in lemon-yellow sock imports through the port of Izmir. No reason given, no analysis provided, just numbers. Fashion historians are still trying to explain the yellow sock spike, but no theory quite satisfies. You smile, imagining one weary clerk slamming his quill down, muttering, "Enough with the lemon socks," before updating the tariff for citrus-colored garments. The socks continued to pour in anyway, so next time someone scoffs at bureaucracy, remember this. In the Ottoman Empire, even your toes weren't safe from paperwork. You find yourself drawn to a shaded alley where the hum of commerce fades into something quieter, almost reverent. A dusty wooden door creaks open beside you, revealing a dim chamber lined wall-to-wall with scrolls, ledgers, and long, thin drawers labeled in calligraphy. Woolen, Western provinces. Silken, capital markets. Ankle length only. Welcome to the ledger room. This is where the sock tax truly came alive, not in concept, but in excruciating, handwritten detail. Inside these archival records, the Ottoman Empire tracked the life of a sock like modern shipping companies track a parcel. Who made it, what it was made of, where it was sold, and, of course, exactly how much tax it owed. You slide open one drawer and unroll a record dated 1558. The parchment crackles under your fingertips. It reads, 1 pair, wool, undyed, ankle height, origin, tokat, tax levied. Birakçe, the next line, nearly identical, adds only a word. Same, striped, tax levied, 1, 25 akçe, and there it is, the decimal dread of sock taxation. A mere stripe costs you a quarter more. It didn't matter if it improved comfort, if it cheered up your outfit. A stripe was, in the eyes of the empire, a luxurious deviation from plainness, and that meant it had to pay. The ledgers aren't just rows of data. They contain tiny, almost poetic annotations. Purchased for wedding, intended for imam's use. Found bundled with soap, inspect smuggling possibility. The bureaucrats, it seems, couldn't resist editorializing. One note even reads, "Excellent heel stitch, likely imported artisan." You imagine some anonymous clerk feeling a quiet thrill at spotting top-tier needlework. And not all socks made it into the records equally. Some entries contain a curious stamp muaf, meaning exempt. These socks were not taxed, usually because they were gifts, donations to mosques, or declared holy garments. But abuse was common. Wealthy citizens often tried to pass off their luxury socks as religious offerings. Historians still argue whether the muaf exemptions were genuinely enforced or simply tolerated by bribed officials. One infamous case from 1623 describes a vizier's son who declared 24 imported velvet socks as prayer foot wraps. The court's judgment: "May Allah accept your devotion, but the treasury cannot." He paid double. The tax categories continued to bloat over time. What began as a simple list: wool, cotton, silk, evolved into subcategories: coastal dyed cotton, mountain sheep wool, swan thread silk, not actually from swans, but impressively soft, add-ons like embroidery, lace trim, and gold thread toes each got their own lines. One record from 1575 lists a sock as three-color weave, alternating ankle pattern, basi, camel wool, 2, mohair blend, dyed in indigo and copper salts, embroidery, peacock motif, intended for spring festival, tax, nina, more than some oxen, and you thought filing your taxes was annoying. As you keep reading, you feel the oddest thing: respect. These ledgers, tedious as they are, mapped not just an economy, but a culture through socks, through threads, through thousands of tired fingers writing by candlelight. You gently roll the parchment closed, place it back, and whisper to the drawer, "Rest well, little sock." The room darkens a little as a cloud passes over the narrow window, and you shuffle deeper into the labyrinth of records. In this chamber of dust and ink, something strange starts to emerge. Socks weren't taxed just by what they were, but by how they looked. That's right, color mattered, style mattered. And yes, Ottoman tax collectors had thoughts about fashion. Let's start with crimson. Crimson socks, rich, deep, vibrant, were practically the celebrities of the sock world. Dyed using cochineal or madder root, they shimmered in the lamplight and whispered, "This ankle is nobility." Of course, the treasury took note. Crimson socks were taxed up to 300% more than their duller cousins. The reasoning, social signaling, the logic: if you're trying that hard to look rich, you probably are. Turquoise, unstable. The dye was expensive and tended to fade quickly in sunlight, making the socks high maintenance. Taxed slightly less than crimson, but still premium tier. Beige, untaxed. Boring, and often overlooked by inspectors unless the beige was silk, in which case, surprise fee, and heaven help you if you tried to pass off one color as another. That's where the Chorap Rink Nezareti, the sock color supervision office, came in. Yes, an entire bureaucratic entity was tasked with determining whether your socks were really the color you claimed. These officials carried swatches. They trained under dye masters. Some were rumored to have perfect color memory. If you claimed your socks were dried apricot, but they read burnt saffron, you could face reclassification and a higher tax bill. Historians still debate whether the color office had real power or was just an excuse for older scribes to stay inside during winter. Fringe scholars point to a mysterious budget spike in 1603 tied to emergency pigment reclassification. Others believe it was part of a wider anti-smuggling initiative because certain rare dyes, like lapis-based blues, often entered the empire illegally through Persian routes. You duck into another stall now, this one overflowing with color. Pairs of socks hang like flags, each tagged with little slips. Vermilion 6, sunset ochre 6, beige, ash gray no tax. The seller sees your interest and offers you a deal. Buy 2 peacocks, get 1 mud tone free. You decline. You've learned enough today to know that a free sock is never free. And beyond color, there was also pattern, stripes, moderate surcharge, spirals. Definitely taxed. Repeating floral motifs. Depends on the flower. Tulips, particularly symbolic in Ottoman culture, were taxed at a prestige rate. One ledger even differentiates between 5-petal tulip weave and 7-petal bloom, the latter drawing an extra half akshay, and if your socks displayed calligraphy, a rare but exquisite style involving short poetic verses stitched into the cuff. You were practically begging the empire to open your wallet. One stunning example survives in a museum today. A pair of navy socks embroidered in gold with a verse that reads, "The path of love begins at the heel." No one knows who wore them, but the tax entry is clear. Luxury category charged at maximum tariff. Poet unknown. You smile as you imagine the wearer stepping slowly into a mosque, each toe wrapped in taxed elegance, the divine and the bureaucratic meeting under a socked arch. Because here, in the Ottoman world, art was tax, fashion was scrutiny, and even your ankles had something to declare. You leave the textile bazaar behind and drift toward a low, domed building at the edge of the city, its walls whitewashed, its doors worn smooth from decades of palms pushing inward. You're stepping into a guild hall now. Not a guild for metal or spice, but for socks. The Çorapçılar Loncası Sockmakers Guild inside. The air smells of lanolin and ink. Bundles of yarn dangle from the ceiling like sleepy chandeliers. Rows of wooden looms creak in the shadows, and sitting among them are the artisans, the sockmasters, quietly pulling loops, counting stitches, their fingers moving like whispers. You find a wall hung with parchment, detailing the guild's rules. They're surprisingly elaborate. No member shall produce socks in a color not approved by the dye council. No apprentices may sell their work unless inspected by a senior weaver. No foreign yarn may be used unless declared at point of origin. And, most curious of all, no sock shall contain more than 3 distinct animal fibers. That's right, there was a fiber cap. The guild system in the Ottoman Empire was both support network and surveillance net. Members were protected from undercutting, but they were also expected to report suspicious behavior. So if a neighbor started cranking out silk wool llama blend socks without approval, that was grounds for investigation. Historians still argue whether these guilds existed primarily to uphold quality or simply to ensure tax compliance. Some say they fostered pride in craftsmanship, pointing to the intricate designs and generational training. Others argue they were quietly enlisted by the empire to help plug revenue leaks. If you wanted to keep your loom, you kept the taxman informed, and then there were the weaving codes. Each master had a signature pattern like a textile fingerprint. It could be a certain twist of color, a unique heel stitch, or a knot placed precisely on the cuff. These weren't just artistic flourishes. They were declarations. This sock came from my loom. I own the taxes, the praise, and the complaints. You hear murmurs from a corner and peek around a loom to find a young apprentice being scolded. His mistake, an unauthorized 4th fiber, goat, sheep, silk, and camel. Too ambitious, his master mutters, snipping the threads with slow disappointment. The boy blushes. Somewhere, a tax inspector has sneezed without knowing why. And yet the guild wasn't all severity. During religious festivals or the Sultan's birthday, the sockmakers would donate fine pairs to local mosques or orphanages, sometimes even stitching blessings into the weave. These gifts, marked in ledgers as hediye çorap, were tax-exempt, though guild leaders still logged them meticulously, just in case. One curious record from 1588 shows that a master sockmaker in Edirne gifted a pair of child-sized socks made from albino lamb wool to the Sultan's youngest son. The tax note simply reads, "Accepted. May the child walk in blessing." It's easy to forget, amid the bureaucracy, that socks were also symbols of care. They warmed the poor. They adorned the devout. They marked milestones, births, marriages, pilgrimages. And for the guilds that made them, they were pride incarnate. You trail a finger along a stack of finished pairs, feeling the softness, the weight, the hours poured into every loop. These weren't just garments. They were life work, taxable life work. Yes, but life work nonetheless. You slip out of the guild hall just as the muezzin's call begins to rise in the distance, long and echoing, folding into the warm afternoon air. The streets have quieted, and for a moment, it feels like the empire is holding its breath. But you know better. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and the scent of grilled lamb, the sock inspectors are still hard at work. Yes, you heard that right, sock inspectors. Officially, they were known as çorap murakipleri, or hosiery regulators, but everyone called them the sock spies. They worked in pairs, drifting through markets and warehouses, temple halls and ferry docks. Their job, to sniff out illegal sock trade, unregistered fibers, or dyed goods that didn't match their tariffs. The tools of their trade included color swatches, pocket scales, fabric testers, and, incredibly, sniffing cloth to identify bootleg dyes. You pass a pair now, leaning casually against a vendor cart, their robes dusty, eyes scanning every foot in sight. They're not looking for criminals. They're looking for anomalies, a shimmer that shouldn't be there, a heel too finely stitched for the declared bracket, or worst of all, a sock with no record. Smuggling socks might sound laughable, but in a trade empire that stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, it was serious business. Entire caravans would hide untaxed hosiery in barrels of lentils or tuck them into saddle linings. A Venetian merchant once tried to sneak 80 pairs of silk socks through customs disguised as decorative wine bottle sleeves. He was fined. Of course, the wine was reportedly excellent. Historians still debate whether these inspectors were more theater than threat. Some believe their presence alone deterred smuggling, much like modern ticket inspectors on empty trains. Others cite cases where sock spies were paid off bribed with money, favors, or, in one case, a rare set of Italian cashmere toe warmers. Apparently, even watchdogs had cold feet. You turn into a narrow alleyway and come upon a forgotten customs station abandoned now, but once alive with activity. A fading sign reads, Gümrük noktası, iç giyim denetimi, customs point, inner wear inspection. Yes, at the empire's peak. They had specific posts for undergarment duties. Socks, being borderline in this category, fell under their jurisdiction whenever someone attempted to import personal attire. It didn't matter if it was for personal use. If it crossed a border and touched your skin, it could be taxed. Inside the tiny room, you find a ledger open to a page dated 1604. It lists 6 pairs smuggled, seized at Selimiye Gate, fine imposed, 18 akçes, contraband destroyed. The final note, scrawled hastily, reads, 1 pair retained for quality review. You can only imagine some inspector slipping them on behind a curtain, just to check the stitching. The Ottoman Empire didn't build its wealth on gold mines or oil wells. It built it on control, over trade, over movement, and, yes, over socks. By monitoring the tiniest of goods, the state learned where its people walked, what they valued, and how much they could pay. It wasn't just surveillance, it was empire through embroidery. And you, drifting back into the sunlight, are starting to feel that somewhere, someone is counting your steps too. You hear the clang of a harbor bell in the distance as your feet carry you downhill, toward the docks where the waters of the Bosphorus glint like molten tin under the sun. Here, among crates of spices, barrels of olives, and shouting porters, lies the darker side of the sock story. Smuggling. You step carefully over thick ropes and discarded fishing nets and find yourself at a customs checkpoint, complete with stern-faced scribes and tar-black ink pads. A guard pulls aside a merchant wagon, muttering something about suspicious stitching. You pause. You know what's coming. A small chest is pried open. The guard pulls out what looks like a roll of parchment until he unravels it and reveals rows upon rows of finely folded socks, silk, embroidered. Definitely not declared. The merchant protests, insists they're for a cousin's wedding. But the guard taps the official manifest, no socks listed, and thus they become contraband. Ottoman customs officials were notoriously strict when it came to textiles, especially anything imported from Europe. Venetian goods were particularly scrutinized, partly because of their quality, but mostly because of politics. Venice was both a trade partner and a rival, and its luxurious stockings were coveted by the Ottoman elite. Historians still argue whether the high scrutiny of European socks was purely economic or laced with political paranoia. Some suggest the empire feared the spread of European influence, one embroidery at a time. Others think it was simpler. Venetian socks were just really, really nice. You wander into a warehouse near the docks, long abandoned. Crates still bear faded chalk markings Avis, Epic, and occasionally Corap. Some are smashed, their contents gone. Others remain sealed, dust dancing above them like ghosts. You open one, inside, socks. Faded, sure, but clearly once expensive. Silk woven with fine metallic thread, perhaps gold, perhaps copper. There's a ledger pinned inside the lid. It reads, "Received in secrecy, Venetian must disguise as curtain tassels." Curtain tassels. That was one of many euphemisms smugglers used. Others included wrist covers, foot shrouds, or even marital trinkets, anything to sneak them through checkpoints. You have to admire the creativity and the audacity. One famous case from 1615 involved an entire shipment of forbidden French stockings disguised as dried figs. The ruse nearly worked until a dock worker noticed a fig with stitching. Customs raids were sometimes theatrical. Inspectors would unroll carpets, slice open sacks of flour, even yank apart donkeys' saddlebags looking for hidden socks. Rewards were given for major busts. One tax agent even earned a house outside Bursa for exposing a ring of Armenian traders moving embroidered socks under fake wine licenses. And what about the punishments? If you were caught smuggling socks, penalties ranged from hefty fines to public shaming. One merchant in Damascus had to stand barefoot in the bazaar for a week under a sign that read, "He sold feet he did not declare." But for many, the risk was worth it. Ottoman citizens craved what they couldn't have, or at least what they couldn't have, cheaply. So the smuggling continued, through rivers, over mountains, hidden in cloaks, under skirts, inside hollowed-out melons. No route was too ridiculous. You imagine a young courier trotting through the hills at night, 10 pairs of luxury socks strapped to his ribs like forbidden treasure. The empire, meanwhile, watches from its ledgers and lamplight, determined to keep every toe accounted for. The sea air begins to fade as you climb back inland, your path leading you through manicured courtyards, past ornate fountains, and finally beneath the towering gates of Topkapi Palace, the home of the Sultan himself. And here, amid gilded tiles and peacocks lazily preening in the sun, you arrive at the very pinnacle of Ottoman sockdom. Yes, even the Sultan's socks were part of this elaborate, bureaucratic ballet. You're ushered into the Hasoda, the inner chamber reserved for the Sultan's closest attendants. There, folded with reverence on silk pillows, are the royal socks, exquisite, impractical, absurdly beautiful, woven from the finest Persian silk, embroidered with pure gold thread, and sometimes set with tiny seed pearls. Each pair likely required 3 artisans and 1 overly anxious accountant. A court servant walks past carrying a tray, not of food, but of rolled hosiery. For His Majesty's evening prayer, he explains solemnly, as if delivering state secrets. And in a way, he is, because these socks were more than fashion. They were political. Every color, every thread, every swirl of embroidery on the Sultan's feet was a message. Pale green for serenity, gold for divine favor, indigo for the weight of empire. And naturally, every pair was documented, extensively. Historians have uncovered court records listing royal sock inventories organized by season, ceremony, and sentiment. One scroll from 1592 details 32 prayer socks for winter, all tax-exempt, as ordained by decree. Another lists mourning socks worn during a period of imperial grief. Black wool, stitched with verses from the Quran. The palace tailors who produced these masterpieces were members of an elite workshop known as the Saraya Terzihanesi, the imperial sewing house. They lived within the palace, rarely venturing outside, and took vows of secrecy concerning the sultan's measurements. One rumor claims they were required to memorize each royal foot's exact curvature. Fringe scholars, always digging, have even found what they believe to be competitive rankings among palace sockmakers. Notes in the margins like heel stitch, exceeded expectation, or arch support lacking finesse suggest there was a quiet war of prestige happening 1 foot at a time. And, of course, there was the tax embroidery. That's right, certain royal socks were literally stitched with their own tax exemption symbols. A tiny crescent, a stylized tulip, or the Sultan's tugra, his official seal, woven discreetly into the band. These markers told any inspector, clerk, or bold thief, "Don't you dare." Still, there were scandals. One infamous case from 1606 involved a gift from a Persian envoy, 6 pairs of jeweled socks said to have belonged to the Shah himself. Ottoman customs balked. Should these be taxed as imports, or as diplomatic offerings, or, as the court poet argued, as divine art unfit for monetary valuation? Historians still argue whether the socks were taxed at all. Some believe they disappeared into the private wardrobe of the Sultan's favorite concubine. Others claim they were locked in a treasury vault, never worn, too politically volatile for anyone's feet. You wander now through the royal storage room, its shelves heavy with history. Each pair of socks, each faded tag, whispers stories of power, fashion, and imperial obsession, and all of it, every twist of thread, every golden cuff passed under the eyes of the taxman. Because here, at the heart of the Ottoman world, even the Sultan's steps were counted. The palace fades behind you as your path winds toward the sun-drenched plains beyond the city walls, where fields of wheat ripple like golden oceans and donkeys snort lazily under olive trees. You're heading into the rural heart of the empire, where socks were humbler, but no less taxable. Here, life moves slower. Families weave their own clothes. Markets happen once a week, maybe twice in spring. And yet, even out here, where sheep outnumber scribes, the sock tax finds you. You approach a small village stone cottages, a water well, smoke curling from chimney tops, and in the town square, beneath a crooked fig tree, you see the local tax collector. He's not wearing silk. His robe is dusty, but in his lap rests a thick ledger and a bag of copper coins. Around him, a queue of farmers, shepherds, and weavers, each holding out a handful of socks. Yes, in some parts of the Ottoman countryside, taxes could be paid in socks. Wool was the material of choice, scratchy, thick, and sturdy enough to last through mud and mountain. Most were a single color, undyed, stitched hastily by candlelight, but even these plain socks were recorded, counted, valued. The collector eyes each pair like a jeweler inspecting diamonds. He checks weight, weave, stitch consistency. One woman offers 3 pairs of mismatched socks and a basket of eggs to make up the difference. The collector sighs, shrugs, and accepts. And what if someone couldn't or wouldn't pay? Penalties ranged from extra labor to public shaming. One law from the 17th century allowed officials to confiscate livestock equal to the unpaid sock tax value. There are recorded instances of goats being traded for a single pair of underdeclared, embroidered anklets. And yet, out here, there were also quiet rebellions. Historians still argue whether the rural sock resistance of 1641 was a coordinated protest or just a coincidence of bad weather and poor harvests. What's clear is that in certain provinces, especially in the Balkans and Anatolia, villagers began refusing to declare their sock production. They wore their pairs ragged and dirty, claiming they were too old to tax. One provincial governor, irritated by this trend, ordered surprise inspections during Friday markets. His men would grab people by the ankles to check sock quality. Predictably, this led to a barefoot movement, where locals intentionally stopped wearing socks in public to avoid fines. Of course, the empire adjusted. A short-lived edict attempted to tax spindles of wool before they were even made into socks. It failed miserably. Too difficult to enforce, too easy to hide. You sit now by a cottage doorway, where an old woman spins yarn in her lap. She chuckles when you ask about taxes. "We paid them in prayers," she says, "and in socks with holes." Then she lifts a threadbare pair with pride patched 5 times. Heel like gauze. For the empire, the rural tax was about reach, about proving that even the farthest village, the quietest shepherd, was part of the system. But for the villagers, it became something else. A quiet game, a negotiation, a dance between loops and loopholes. Because no matter how far you ran in the Ottoman Empire, the taxman could follow. And sometimes he brought a measuring tape. You rise from the low stone wall near the spinning woman's cottage and follow the sound of bells into the village square. But this time, it's not for trade. A crowd has gathered outside the local mosque, and people are placing bundles into a large, cloth-lined wooden box near the steps. You move closer and realize what it is: the mosque sock box. Yes? In many Ottoman towns, it was customary, sometimes encouraged, sometimes required, to donate socks to the local mosque. These socks weren't for the imam. They were for the poor, for travelers, for pilgrims passing through. A pair of clean, warm socks could be a blessing in winter, and charitable giving was a central pillar of faith. This practice was called sadaka choraba, alms, in the form of hosiery. The box sits open to the sky. Inside are socks of all kinds: coarse wool, neatly darned cotton, even one mismatched pair with a child's name embroidered in the cuff. People drop their donations in without a word. A teenager walks up with a proud grin, sets in 2 pairs he clearly stitched himself, then runs off. You linger beside an old man sitting nearby, nodding toward the box. "Does anyone actually check these?" you ask. He nods. "The imam, every Thursday. He logs them. 2. Got a whole book just for socks." Of course he does. Inside the mosque's side chamber, sure enough, sits a thick ledger labeled Chorap Sadakasa. You flip through it, page after page of entries. 4 pairs wool. Donor anonymous. 1 pair silk. Gift from merchant Ali. 3 pairs cotton. Rejected due to excessive wear. Redirected to laundry. Even donated socks were audited. Historians still argue whether the mosque sock system was primarily charitable or partially co-opted by the state to collect data. Some believe imams were encouraged quietly to report unusually fine sock donations as evidence of undeclared wealth. Others say this was nonsense, pointing to sermons praising sock donations as pure piety. One fringe case from 1629 involved a man who repeatedly donated embroidered silk socks with gold thread. The mosque accepted them at first, but then suspicion brewed. Where was he getting them? Why donate so many? It turned out he was laundering luxury smuggling by disguising them as religious gifts. When the scheme was uncovered, he was ordered to fund the construction of a new water fountain and barred from donating socks ever again. You trace your fingers over one particularly old pair on a nearby shelf, thick, gray, and patched nearly to death. They've been kept, it seems, not because of value, but because someone remembered who gave them. And sometimes, that's all a sock really needs to be. It's in this quiet mosque, with its humble sandalwood scent and birds nesting in the rafters, that you realize the sock tax wasn't just about power or paperwork. It was also culture, a way for people to give, to receive, to be seen, even in their lowest, humblest forms, because in the Ottoman Empire, even the smallest act, pulling off a worn sock and placing it in a box, was wrapped in ritual, and someone, somewhere, definitely wrote it down. As you leave the village and wander through the fields beyond, the wind begins to bite at your ankles. The sky darkens slightly. Winter is near, and with winter came seasonal sock surveillance. Yes, the sock tax wasn't static. It breathed with the seasons, just like crops and coats and coal. In colder months, when demand for warm clothing surged, the Ottoman tax system grew particularly attentive. Socks, as the empire's smallest and most quietly essential garment, were swept into the spotlight. You pass a caravan huddled near a roadside inn. The traders are lighting a fire, their donkeys steaming in the cold, their cargo tarped tightly. But even here, in the chill, a tax inspector looms. He's wrapped in layers of wool but carries a familiar ledger. He's not here to tax grain or tin. He's inspecting winter hosiery. During harsh months, socks were taxed differently. Heavier materials drew higher fees. Double weave socks, premium rate. Any pair lined with fur, declare or pay double. And if you dared to sell imported warmth like Flemish knitwear or Crimean cashmere without a proper winter goods license, you might find yourself explaining your sock drawer to a regional magistrate. Historians still argue whether these seasonal taxes were intended to raise funds for state heating subsidies or simply a way to squeeze more coin from an already freezing populace. There's no consensus, only stories. One tells of a tax official in Erzurum, known for its brutal winters, who allegedly tried to tax unborn socks by levying fees on knitting needles in October. The resulting public outcry forced the cancellation of the knit tax within 2 weeks. The needles marched. Metaphorically, another tale, possibly apocryphal, describes a family who trained their sheep to sleep in sock shapes to avoid both taxes and the cold. The practice never caught on, but the image lives rent-free in historians' heads. Meanwhile, tax collectors were seasonal creatures too. Some posted in icy mountain passes, asked to be transferred to warmer districts from November to March. Others grew suspiciously lenient in January, waving off extra charges with muttered blessings and a shiver. One surviving document from 1654 notes an entire ledger page stamped abandoned due to frost. Of course, for some, winter sock season was a goldmine. Urban sock makers timed their releases like fashion houses today, hoarding their warmest, fluffiest, thickest socks for the first real frost. There were waiting lists. Royal servants would even line up at bazaars with sealed orders from noblewomen. 2 pairs, ivory goat wool, knee-high, with floral trim, for palace gardens in snow. You imagine it now, one such noble, gliding through frosted courtyards, hem of her dress lifted just enough to flash the tiniest hint of taxed to the heavens sock embroidery. And all around, bureaucrats watched from behind ink-stained windows, quills twitching, hoping to catch a glimpse of an unrecorded loop. Because in winter, warmth wasn't just comfort, it was currency, and even the coldest toes owed their share. You trudge along a slushy cobbled road now, the damp creeping through your boots as the wind whistles low across the rooftops. It's the kind of weather that makes you wish for another pair of socks, maybe 2. But before you dare even imagine that luxury, remember, in the Ottoman Empire, too many socks could make you suspicious. You've reached the era of sock hoarders and closet crackdowns. Yes, there were those wealthy merchants, ambitious tailors, sly provincial elites who saw socks not just as garments, but as assets. Quiet, rollable, and highly portable. Socks could be stockpiled like coin, and some people did exactly that. You turn into the courtyard of a mansion just outside Edirne, where tax records once described excessive personal inventory of domestic hosiery. The man who lived here, a silk dealer named Hassan Effendi, had amassed over 400 pairs of socks in a single wing of his home. When inspectors finally gained access after 3 denied visits and 1 well-bribed butler, they found them stashed in ceramic jars, travel trunks, and even under cushions. His explanation: they are for gifts. The ledger's response: unconvincing. Taxation applied in full? This wasn't an isolated case. Once the empire realized socks were being quietly hoarded to avoid rising prices and seasonal levies, officials began conducting wardrobe audits. Imagine it. You're sipping tea in your courtyard, minding your own feet, when a knock comes at the door. 3 men in official robes, one holding a ledger, one a small weighing scale, and the third perhaps unnecessarily carrying shears. We're here about your sock situation. And so begins the closet crackdown. Tax agents would inspect wardrobes for surplus, undeclared, or excessively luxurious pairs. Anything over a reasonable number, usually 5 to 10 pairs per household, depending on region and class, was liable for retroactive tax. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or just a capital city phenomenon. Some provinces resisted fiercely. In one notable rebellion from 1681, a guild in Bursa locked its storerooms and refused entry to inspectors, citing private stitch rights. The standoff lasted 3 days and ended when the clerks agreed to inspect only outerwear. Naturally, citizens got creative. Socks were hidden inside mattress stuffing, sewn into curtains, rolled into the arms of dolls. One eccentric nobleman even commissioned a false-bottomed drawer system specifically for sensitive hosiery. It worked until a fire broke out and revealed his secret stockpile to the entire neighborhood. There were also attempts to launder socks, not with water, but with paperwork. Some merchants would sell their socks to relatives on paper, then claim they had no personal stock. Others would list 200 pairs as samples for a non-existent store. One widow allegedly declared her dead husband's sock collection as inheritance assets and applied for an exemption on religious grounds. The case dragged on for 4 years, and through it all, the empire adapted, adjusted, added new lines to the ledgers, created forms for sock reclassification, inventory amnesty, and, eventually, a voluntary donation program in which people could offer extra pairs in exchange for reduced property tax. You stare now at a stone plaque on the side of an old warehouse. The inscription is faded, but one word remains legible: chorap, socks. The empire watched your closet, not because it cared about your toes, but because it understood something deeper. What people stash away, they often value most. And where value lives, the taxman is never far behind. You shake off the snow from your coat and duck into a dimly lit tea house, warm, smoky, the air thick with the scent of cardamom and clove. Around you, locals sip from tiny glasses and trade gossip under low whispers. One table erupts with laughter, and as you drift closer, you catch the punchline. And so he told them he didn't wear socks at all. The laughter grows. You've just stumbled upon one of the Ottoman Empire's strangest phenomena: tax evasion by toenail. That's right. As the sock tax grew more complex, creative citizens found ever more ridiculous ways to dodge it. And eventually, a peculiar loophole emerged. Simply claim that you didn't wear socks. At first, this might seem implausible. Socks were practical, common, and even in poorer areas, typically worn year-round. But in certain circles, especially among eccentric scholars, wandering dervishes, and economic minimalists, the idea of going sockless became a quiet form of rebellion. You finish your tea and step back outside. wandering down a side street where a cluster of dusty documents lies preserved behind glass in a forgotten archive. One page stands out, a declaration from 1662. Citizen claims permanent barefoot status due to spiritual discipline. Requests exemption from hosiery levy. The official reply: approved. Reevaluate if shoes are ever worn. It worked for a time. Soon, others followed suit. A teacher in Anatolia claimed to wear only wooden sandals year-round. A merchant swore his feet were allergic to textiles. One nobleman even developed a bizarre backstory involving a snakebite that made his ankles reject wool. Historians still argue whether these cases were sincere or simply clever theater. Some fringe scholars suggest a kind of proto-sockless movement, with minor political undertones, a protest not just against taxes, but against the creeping fingers of empire and personal life. Others say, nonsense. They just didn't want to pay. Whatever the motivation, the empire took notice. A new clause was introduced in several provincial tax codes, requiring footwear verification for suspected evaders. Inspectors would visit homes, check footwear storage, and even conduct street patrols, discreetly watching who wore socks beneath their robes. Some people doubled down. They began walking barefoot even in winter, earning nicknames like Icefoot Ali or the Goat of Toket. Others compromised by crafting ankle bracers that technically weren't socks, but offered warmth. Those entered a gray zone of debate that unsurprisingly led to more paperwork. One particularly absurd case from 1703 involved a man who wore papier-mâché socks as a form of performance protest. Lightweight, biodegradable, and utterly useless in rain, but he wore them proudly, declaring, "the only socks not worthy of tax." Eventually, Ottoman officials attempted to tighten the loophole. A short-lived decree from the late 1600s mandated that all adult men in taxable professions must wear registered footwear. It collapsed within months. The empire realized that mandating socks was more trouble than taxing them. You glance down at your own feet, suddenly conscious of your footwear, and you wonder if a tax could bend reality this far. Where would it end? In the Ottoman Empire, even your toes had paperwork. But sometimes, that just made people kick off their shoes and run. You wander beyond the city walls now, where low hills roll gently into orchards and quiet hamlets. The roads here are softer, less watched, the landscape open and breezy. But don't let the peace fool you, because in one of these sleepy villages, barely a dot on an imperial map, the sock tax pushed people too far. And that's how you learn about the Wool Rebellion. It begins quietly. You pass a well, then a cluster of fig trees, and come upon a stone marker overgrown with ivy. A local boy spots your curiosity and calls out, "That's for the sock war." You pause. He grins, shrugs, and runs off. You didn't mishear. In the spring of 1697, a farming village in the province of Karaman erupted in protest over newly raised sock tariffs. The local weavers, already burdened by wool shortages and a particularly harsh winter, were hit with a double duty on dyed socks. Worse still, the inspectors sent from the capital arrived unannounced, demanding not only tax, but back pay for previous seasons. The villagers refused. At first, it was passive. They hid their socks, claimed they were unfinished, claimed they were family heirlooms, claimed they were ceremonial. But then it turned physical. When inspectors returned with soldiers, they found themselves locked out of the storage barn. Inside, hundreds of woolen socks, stitched, bundled, and hung from the rafters like garlic. The villagers stood guard. Women threw pepper dust. A shepherd reportedly released a goat inside the scribe's quarters. The standoff lasted 2 days. Eventually, the provincial governor intervened not with soldiers, but with a compromise. Taxes were halved for rural guilds, provided they agreed to standardized dyes and annual inspections. Historians still debate whether this incident truly qualifies as a rebellion. Some call it a minor dispute. Others, particularly those from Karaman, refer to it as the Chorap Isyana, the sock uprising. You can find it referenced in local poetry and even carved into a fountain. A pair of wool socks crossed like swords. There were other, smaller skirmishes too. In 1711, a group of young apprentices in Bursa refused to pay their training sock tax, a small levy charged on every pair woven during their first year. They marched through the city barefoot, chanting slogans. No one was hurt, but the visual made it into court sketches. One angry bureaucrat scrawled, "Rebellion begins at the toes." Even in distant provinces, inspectors grew cautious. In Macedonia, officials reportedly disguised themselves as traveling musicians to enter villages without drawing attention. They carried hidden ledgers in flute cases. One report noted that a scribe was nearly tarred for inquiring after striped anklewear. The truth is, rebellions, big or small, often reflect a deeper fatigue, a weariness of rules, of intrusions, of constant counting. The sock tax, for all its quirks and color, was still a burden, and sometimes, when the wind blew just right, people pushed back. You pass the village square where the Karaman protest began. A stone bench sits empty, surrounded by wildflowers. Someone has left a pair of children's socks there, bright red, crudely stitched, clearly handmade. No tax tag, no inspection. Just a quiet memorial to a time when socks stopped being funny and started being enough. You find yourself back in the city now, trailing the hem of a scholar's robe as he winds through the narrow corridors of a university quarter. Students chatter beneath arched walkways, some hunched over calligraphy, others deep in theological debate. But one group sits quietly in the corner, poring over a table strewn with old papers and ink-stained fingers. They're arguing over socks. You lean in and catch fragments of the conversation. Luxury tax or cultural symbol? One says. Was it revenue or ritual? Asks another. They're dissecting the sock tax, centuries after it unraveled. And you've walked straight into a scholarly debate that still refuses to wear thin. Historians remain divided. One camp argues that the sock tax was merely an offshoot of broader textile tariffs, practical, bureaucratic, impersonal, a way to extract coin from a population increasingly obsessed with fashion. This view paints socks as a small cog in the imperial machine, no more symbolic than a belt or a button. But others insist otherwise. They see the sock tax as a mirror reflecting deeper truths about Ottoman society. Class, control, cultural signaling. To them, socks weren't just taxed. They were watched, interpreted, managed. The empire used clothing to map identity, to monitor excess, to define boundaries literally, from the ankle down. One historian even suggests that the sock tax operated as a soft census, recording more than revenue. By tracking materials, colors, origins, and destinations, officials were quietly mapping trade routes, economic shifts, and social mobility. You scan a nearby chalkboard scrawled with notes from a recent lecture. Were rural exemptions acts of mercy or control? Did mosques act as moral laundering machines? Why were striped socks taxed differently in Edirne than in Aleppo? Each question opens a thread, and the more you tug, the more the empire unravels one loop at a time. Fringe theories abound. Of course, one obscure scholar in Izmir claims that the sock tax was a coded message to European envoys, proof that the Ottoman Empire could manage its people down to their toes. Another, even more eccentric, believes that the palace sock records were actually a form of data divination, used to predict trade surges and spiritual shifts. He was politely removed from a conference in 1983. You chuckle at the absurdity and the sincerity, because whether serious or speculative, everyone seems to agree on one thing. No other tax of its size left such a strangely detailed paper trail. Scrolls, ledgers, guild rules, palace inventories, court cases, sermons, poetry. You could write an entire social history of the Ottoman world through socks, and some have tried. One record you pass is titled simply Threads of Power. Inside, 267 pages on how sock tariffs mirrored the rise and fall of textile guilds. Another book, thinner but bolder, bears the title To Tax a Toe, Bureaucracy and Identity in the Sublime Empire. It opens with a quote, "In a place where even shadows were catalogued, did we truly expect our footsteps to go unnoticed? You let the words settle." Because that's what the sock tax really was, wasn't it? A record of movement, of how people walked, what they wore, where they stepped, and why it mattered. And here, among dusty archives and overeager students, you feel the weight of history not in wars or treaties, but in something much smaller. A stitch, a stripe, a footfall made visible. The afternoon light slants through latticed windows as you slip out of the university quarter and descend into the merchants' district, once the humming heart of the empire's economy. The shops have changed, the signage modernized, but traces of the past still whisper through the brickwork and narrow lanes. You follow your feet, drawn to an old customs house now serving as a museum, and inside, behind glass, sits something rather unremarkable at first glance. A single wool sock, yellowed with age, its threads frayed, its cuff delicately embroidered with a barely visible tulip. But the plaque below it tells another story. Example of tariffed rural hosiery, Ottoman Empire, circa 1730. This humble relic isn't just fabric, it's evidence. Because even now, centuries later, the legacy of the sock tax lingers in ways you might not expect. The Ottoman sock tax didn't disappear all at once. Like many empires, the Ottomans modernized slowly, layer by dusty layer. But by the 19th century, as steamships docked with French boots and British knits, and as printing presses churned out reformist manifestos, the old fabric taxes began to fray. Customs codes were rewritten. Clothing categories consolidated. The chorap vergisi, once proudly itemized, was absorbed into broader tariffs. The sock lost its line, but it never lost its influence. Historians still argue whether modern customs systems owe their structure to Ottoman innovations. Some point to the detailed classifications in 18th century ledgers as precursors to the harmonized tariff schedule. Others see it as parallel evolution. But there's no question that the Ottomans pioneered something rare, the systematic taxation of small things, and the belief that even the tiniest item could carry economic weight. That philosophy survives today in import fees, textile duties, and customs forms that still ask whether your clothing is decorative or functional. And the bureaucracy, it lives on. One customs form from 1882, during the late Tanzimat reform period, still separates socks by fiber, wool, cotton, silk. Even in the empire's twilight, someone was counting toes. In fact, echoes of the Ottoman sock tax show up in the most unexpected places. In early 20th century French import taxes on hosiery, modeled on Eastern enumeration methods. In British colonial mandates where Indian weavers were taxed per garment including foot wraps, in Turkish bureaucratic slang, where a redundant paper trail is still sometimes called a çorap listesi, a sock ledger, and beyond law, the sock tax left its mark in literature, jokes, and memory. One popular children's rhyme from the early Republic era begins, "Don't hoard socks. The ledger sees pay the pasha's ankle fees. The tax may be gone, but the rhythm remains. You wander through the rest of the museum, past glass cases filled with looms, stamps, thread samples, even a battered ledger open to a page reading simply, Inventory, 1637, Crimson Pear, disputed, and in one quiet corner, you find a guest book. A visitor has scribbled in the margin, "My grandmother said her grandfather paid taxes with socks. I thought it was a joke. Maybe it wasn't." You smile. Because really, that's the legacy. Not just records and ledgers, but whispers, worn into family stories, folklore, and the way a culture sees its past, not through crowns or cannons, but through cuffs and stitches. Because the Ottoman sock tax wasn't just about fabric. It was about how a mighty empire watched its people's smallest steps. As dusk folds over the city and lanterns flicker to life, you make your way to the banks of the Bosphorus. The water glimmers like old silver. The streets are quieter now, and you can almost hear the pages of history turning behind shuttered shop doors. This is where it unravels. The sock tax, once detailed to the thread, once recorded with religious fervor, eventually faced something even it couldn't survive: modernity. The unraveling wasn't dramatic. No angry mobs, no proclamations, just a slow, tired shedding of the old skin, one tangled bureaucratic string at a time. You find yourself outside a forgotten government building, its windows shuttered, its stones stained with salt air. Somewhere in there, once upon a time, clerks sat with ledgers open, tallying every tulip stitch and sheep thread sock that passed through Istanbul. But by the late 19th century, the world was shifting. Steam-powered looms flooded the markets with socks so cheap and abundant that tracking them became absurd. Trade tariffs were rewritten, guilds dissolved or merged, and under pressure from European advisors, Ottoman bureaucrats were told to simplify, and so the sock tax began to fade. One ministerial note from 1885 bluntly states, "It is no longer practical to enumerate items of such minute textile construction. Consolidation recommended." Translated, "We're done counting socks." Historians still debate when exactly the tax ended. Some say it was fully absorbed into general clothing duties by 1891. Others believe it quietly lingered in backwater provinces, haunting ledgers like a ghost with very warm feet. One last reference appears in a customs document from 1894, where a frustrated clerk scribbles, "Socks again. Tell them to bundle under misky garments. I'm retiring." And just like that, centuries of stitched surveillance came to an end. But something strange happened. As the empire moved on, people began to miss the old sock tax. Not the fees, of course, but the stories, the specificity, the way it made even the poorest shepherd feel seen by an empire of ink and cloth. You sit now beside an elderly man at the ferry dock. He hums a song under his breath, tapping his cane. They used to say the empire knew a man by his heels. He says suddenly, without turning, "If you lied about your socks, what else would you lie about?" You nod, unsure if he's quoting someone or just remembering. Because that's the strange beauty of the sock tax. Its disappearance only deepened its myth. It became a symbol of something older, slower, and strangely human. A time when someone somewhere cared enough to ask, "What's on your feet today?" And in that question lived a philosophy, a world view, a kind of soft surveillance that somehow felt personal. Because when a government looks at your toes, it's not about control. It's about curiosity. And the sock tax, in all its silliness and sophistication, was the Ottoman Empire's way of paying attention. Night has finally fallen. You walk slowly now, lantern in hand, weaving through quiet alleys lit only by the amber glow of oil lamps and the hush of closed shutters. The city exhales around you. Istanbul or Constantinople, depending on who's writing the map, has always carried its secrets beneath layers of stone and silence. And as your steps echo on the smooth stone path, you think about the final footnotes of this tale. The sock tax didn't end with fanfare. It didn't need to. It left behind something far more lasting. A legacy of meticulous absurdity that still hums through every customs form, every barcode, every bureaucrat sighing at a spreadsheet. You climb a narrow staircase toward an old archive, where a caretaker lets you in with a wink. He knows what you're here to see. Inside, On the highest shelf, behind 3 cracked volumes of agricultural tariffs, rests a slim, cloth-bound ledger, the title barely legible. Çorap vergisi defteri 1702. You open it. The handwriting is neat, the ink faded but intact. Pages and pages of socks, not just counted, but described: wool, ankle high, dyed with walnut, silk thread toe, possibly Armenian origin, donated pair with minor fraying accepted as is. Each line is a whisper, a person, a purpose, a glimpse into a world where even the smallest things mattered. You trace your fingers down the column until you find one last entry, scrawled in the margin by a tired clerk. This is the last one. May future ledgers be lighter. There's something profoundly moving in that line. Not just resignation, but hope. That maybe, one day, the empire would stop counting socks and start counting something else. Joy, maybe, or dreams, or moments that didn't need a receipt. Historians today still stumble upon these ledgers in dusty basements and forgotten vaults. Some laugh, some sigh, some marvel at the audacity of a civilization that tracked its feet with such care, and some, like you, feel something else. A strange, soft warmth, not unlike a wool sock on a cold night. Because in the end, the Ottoman sock tax wasn't really about socks. It was about presence. Attention, the belief that even the smallest detail deserves notice, that every citizen, no matter how poor or how far, left footprints worth tracing. And now, as you close the ledger and step out into the night, those footsteps are yours, wrapped in the quiet comfort of a tax no one asked for but no one quite forgets.